So I'm really pleased to introduce Susan Clayton to our Climate Change and Mental Health Social Hour. I'm really honored to have her here. Susan is an old friend and colleague for me, and I was thinking about her today. You know, part of this group is meant to be a social hour, meant to meet people and to make connection with people that are doing this work. And that, I think, how I literally met Susan originally was at a social hour at one of the American Psychological Association conferences some years ago. And I, remember feeling a little bit out of place there in that group, not coming from environmental psychology background, coming from clinical psychology background, like a lot, some of you have also dealt with. But I remember, remembering Susan and some of the other folks in the crowd there just being very welcoming of me, and I remember that and just welcoming me in and encouraging me in what I was doing. I think what we think of as environmental and conservation psychology and eco psychology and these field names that we're working in. Susan's really helped to build a lot of this in her work, and she set a really high bar for scholarship and research. And also in a very polite and collegial way, I find, Susan's been very, opening and welcoming of a lot of other people, and quietly, working and building, amassing a really, impressive list of publications and really moving things forward, even adding this idea of conservation psychology to the mix was quite radical at the time, and, kind of quietly pushing that forward. So going back to Susan's work with Susan Apatow and Amara Brook and Carol Saunders, this really, really great stuff that, a lot of people, use as their basis, their basis for the work. And I got a chance to also work with Susan on the earlier APA climate change task force, and got to spend time with her through that, and got to co-author a paper on mental health impacts of climate change with Susan that's been really well cited, and it's been really, really, there's some sense of accomplishment that paper has really taken off and been cited over 500 times, and it's really given people permission to talk about mental health impacts. So it's great. So I think Susan has really brought a lot, bringing a relational perspective to environmental psychology and the sense of conservation psychology and our relationship with other species, and just broadly our social, in terms of social psychology and our relationships. And also being a woman, a voice of a woman at a time when many of the leaders in the environmental psychology field, they were, like with a lot of areas of psychology, all men, so Susan's really been a pathfinder, in a lot of ways, and I have a great respect for her. So I'm hoping she can talk a little bit about her early thinking about environmental identity, something we all take for granted now. But again, that was a radical thing to talk about some years ago as well. So talking about that, and maybe some anecdotes from her work in the Ipcc and other things that she's up to. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan.
Great. Thanks, Thomas. That was a very nice introduction, and it's nice to see you. And it feels a little, to be here with other people who have been working with me in this field for a long time. It's obviously something we all worked on together, and obviously Janet spearheading that task force that I think had such a huge impact, both on the research and in sort of the profession. I'm honored to be part of this series, and in fact, I just really like the format of the idea of having this relatively informal chance for people to briefly talk about their work and then chat. I think is wonderful, and to some extent maybe replicate some of what you were talking about at APA, Thomas. And I will say that almost all of us probably feel out of place at APA because it's, at an APA conference, because it's so enormous and it incorporates such a wide diversity of people. But I have found the conference incredibly useful as a place to meet people who weren't exactly like me, but nevertheless had some shared goals and values. So just a little plug for the importance of sort of putting yourself into places where it may not feel that everybody else is exactly sharing your professional identity, because that's the way we make progress. Following what I thought were hints from Thomas, I I'm not going to show any slides. I'm going to be more informal. So you can look at my face, or you can look at whatever you want to on your screen, or you can close your eyes and think of your happy place. I thought I would start by talking, though, about environmental identity, because that's really some of the earliest work that I did that was squarely in the environmental area. And I was actually, I can't remember why, there was a reason for this, but I was sort of looking back through my CV to see when was the last time I published a paper that was not environmental, and when was that transition? And I think it was when I started working on environmental identity that certainly I began to move into completely working on environmental issues. And I wanted to say a little bit, because I think this is important for psychologists, about how I thought of that, the idea of environmental identity. It really was from many years of reading and listening that I started to think about, the psychological significance of the natural world, and things people said and things people were quoted as saying, and thinking about that relationship with the natural world as an identity. As many of you probably realize, there are a lot of similar concepts. There's a lot of maybe even conceptual confusion, which actually is true of a lot of psychology. So there was sort of a zeitgeist where a lot of people started to think about issues involving the human relationship with the natural world. And I remember, I'm pretty sure it was it one of Peter Kahn's early books that was called The Human Relationship with Nature, or maybe it was, Stephen and Rachel Kaplan. I do remember thinking that they had already taken all the good titles, and I had to come up with a different title for my book on the topic. But it was, so we hear about connection to nature and connectedness to nature and nature relatedness, and they're definitely all relevant. But I wanted to say a little bit about what it meant to me to think about it as an identity. And again, I'm trained as a social psychologist, so and in fact had done some work on, as Janet has, coincidentally, on gender and gender identity, and the importance of sort of demographic identities, racial identities. So I was thinking about what an identity is from a sort of social psychological perspective, and also personality. And some of what I was thinking of was that identities are something that in part we construct, although they're also imposed on us, but we build our identities based on our experiences, and the experiences that are memorable, and the experiences that have emotional resonance, and often those are experiences in the company of other people. So I was thinking in part about that idea that why would people have this environmental identity? It's partly because they tend to have significant memorable experiences in the natural environment, very emotionally resonant experiences, and partly because natural environments are places where people tend to reflect. They tend to think about themselves and their goals. And if I can do this quickly, I'll show you this one slide that I like. No, it's not giving me the option. So, nah, I won't bother. It's just a Calvin and Hobbes cartoon talking about the importance of being in nature for thinking about yourself. So thinking about that idea that we form a relatively enduring, stable sense of ourselves based on these experiences in nature. And then identities, we establish them because they fulfill certain core needs. So we have needs to feel connected, we have needs to feel in control, to feel good about ourselves, feel some sense of understanding of the world. And I thought that the relationship with the natural world did provide a good way for people to help to fulfill some of those core needs in ways that you can ask me questions about if you want. And then identities are important because they actually, and this is something sociologists would certainly point to, they put us in a network. They connect us to others. They sort of group us. They say who we're like and who we're not like. So having an environmental identity obviously says you're like other environmental entities and like other people who care about the environment. And then there's, of course, a lot of research literature on the impact of identities on how we respond to things. So we tend to have we pay more attention to things that are relevant to our identities. And I always think about things like, if I'm in the airport and somebody says, oh, I strike up a conversation with somebody and it turns out they're also from Ohio, or they're also a psychologist. Even though I don't actually care that much about being from Ohio, but suddenly somebody else from Ohio, especially if I'm in an airport or someplace else around the world, it becomes relevant. I'm going to pay attention because it's part of my identity. And I'm going to also have a stronger emotional response to things that are relevant to my identity. So I think it matters to think about not just that sense of a connection or a relationship with the natural world, but the idea that we can form these identities about it. And more recently, I'm now sort of jumping over about 15 years, what I've been working on has to do with climate change and how we're affected by climate change, particularly mental health, but mental health very broadly defined to include sort of psychosocial well-being. And I think when we think about the idea or take seriously the idea of an environmental identity, that helps to say why climate change is going to have some of the kinds of impacts that it has. Obviously, there's lots of ways in which the social identity part makes a difference. So our social identities in this context, and not just this country, very much define whether we pay attention to the issue, how we respond to it, how we interpret it, how we label it. But also, to the extent that people have a strong environmental identity, they're going to pay more attention to climate change. They're going to care more about it, and potentially feel more anxious about it. And I've certainly found that to be the case. And if it's relevant to your identity and it's changing, I mean, people talk a lot about climate change as an existential crisis. This is a word that comes up over and over, existential, with the idea that it challenges the most basic things we believe to be true about the world. I think, I don't know if any of you are developmental psychologists, I'm certainly not, but I know that children need to develop senses of security and stability. And we like to take certain things for granted. You'd like to take your primary caregivers for granted. And Louise Chawla has suggested that in a similar way, we like to be able to take certain environments for granted. And being able to take the environment for granted, just like being able to take a caregiver for granted, allows the child the freedom to explore. So you can't really explore, you can't really roam unless there's something that you can take for granted is going to be still there when you come back. And we take for granted that the earth, that the ecosystem is going to persist more or less the same, that the sun is going to rise in the morning, which is I'm pretty sure is still going to happen despite climate change, that there's going to be a spring every year, that the swallows will return to Capistrano, that the cherry blossoms will bloom in Washington, D.C., and so on and so forth. And more of those things are changing. And so what I think is happening from a psychological point of view is that this challenges the sort of some of the very core knowledge that we have. And so it's very disruptive and disturbing and disorienting in that sense. And especially for people who feel that strong sense of personal connection to and identification with the natural world. Actually, I wanted to say a little bit more about mental health impacts on climate change impacts on mental health. I know some of you have been thinking about this for a long time, but this is what I've been working on for the Ipcc. And I'll just say the evidence is pretty good. We have lots and lots of data about impacts of natural disasters, on mental health, increasing things like PTSD, depression, substance abuse, anxiety, domestic violence, suicide, suicidal ideation. So that's not new, although it's important that we talk about it. What is also happening, if you think about climate change a little bit, you realize that it's going to fundamentally change all kinds of kind of social structure in ways that are very important. Janet was talking earlier today about migration. So communities will be broken up, have to relocate. Climate change will affect our physical infrastructure. Bridges will break, cities will be flooded. It will change our economic infrastructure, occupations. Some occupations are going to be threatened. Some new occupations will probably arise. Our food system, very fundamentally, is going to be threatened. Changing weather patterns and broader climate patterns affect agricultural potential. And even though some places will benefit, and if you read the New York Times, they were just talking about how Russia is in line there to do really well under climate change, so is Canada. But people who know about this have said that overall the sum effect will be negative. So there is an expectation of more food insecurity. So these things, the migration, the loss of place, the food insecurity, all of these, of course, are going to have mental health impacts, both because they're stressful and because in some cases they take away the things that help us to be resilient. If you have to leave your hometown, you're losing, again, that home base, that security, but also that social network, especially the sort of loose social ties that can be so important. As the physical infrastructure changes, may be harder to get medical care. That's going to threaten mental health for a lot of people. Losing your job is definitely a threat to mental health. So there are all those sort of indirect impacts. But I think what's really fairly new, and I have to admit, really interesting to me from a conceptual point of view, is this idea of climate anxiety, eco-anxiety, whatever you want to call it. The idea that people's mental health is affected not by direct experience of the impacts of climate change, but by their knowledge about climate change, that knowing that this is a problem in the world. And that's where I think that that threat to our existential conceptions of the way things work comes into play. And especially, again, for people who have a strong sense of connection to the natural world. And one thing I'll just kind of throw out there, which I haven't looked into at all, but which several people are beginning to talk about, and which I think is really interesting, is the sort of connection to parenthood. So I'm sure some of you are aware of there have been I think at least a couple of groups that have formed to talk about decisions not to have children because of climate change. There was a paper, the first paper that I'm aware of was published just recently. It did not sort of say how many people are thinking this as a percentage of the population. It interviewed people who already were thinking that, who self-identified as being concerned about climate change and having that affect their reproductive decisions. But those are some pretty big, significant life choices that are being affected by people's worry. I've also been hearing about a lot of new or fairly new parents reporting that their eco-anxiety is really magnified as they start to think about the fact that they have brought this child into the world. And they don't feel confident about the future that lies ahead for that child. And as a mother of 20-year-olds, I still feel that way. But when you have a few-month-old or a few years old child, everything still seems so much more raw and new that I think it's a very profound emotional impact that a lot of women are feeling. And part of what's happening is that, it's the women who have been reporting it. I have no, maybe some of you have talked to men about this. would be surprised if there aren't men feeling it too, but it's the women who are talking about it so far. Yeah, lost my train of thought there a little bit. But thinking again about environmental identity, I want to understand the anxiety and grief that people are experiencing, but I also want to think about resilience. And I think thinking about environmental identity maybe points to some directions for encouraging resilience. And that is, one of those is, and I know, Thomas will agree with me, and probably, and Pat, and probably a number of others of you, is to encourage people to reconnect to nature, because if nature is such a significant source of support, and you're stressed out, then go out and reconnect to nature, and especially if it's something that's already important to you. And I really, I hope that we can think not just about doing that at an individual level, but about encouraging that to happen at a societal level. I'm not quite sure how to do that. But as a society, if we kind of validate and promote the opportunity for people to have those connections with nature, that's going to be a lot more impactful. So, for example, thinking about the ability to have access to healthy nature as a fundamental human right, which certainly constitutions of several countries have already argued. And I think a lot of people would agree, but you have to talk about it to get it enshrined into policy. Another source of resilience, I would say, is to help people affirm. So one of the ways you kind of strengthen your sense of identity, especially when it's threatened, is to affirm your core values. So if you're feeling anxiety about climate change and environmental degradation, ways to affirm your value for the environment might help. And one of the ways that I think this can happen is, one of the problems for people who are experiencing climate anxiety is that it is so socially contested. So you might be challenged if you say, I'm really feeling grief about what's happening to the environment. Somebody might say, oh, you're just being silly, you're being a hippie, or perhaps even worse, there's nothing to worry about. I think validating people's concerns is going to be important, because when something, some people might feel anxiety for inappropriate reasons, and maybe you can talk them out of it. But people who are feeling anxious about the environment, there's a good reason to feel anxious. So if you try to help them by saying, oh, don't worry, they're not going to stop worrying, but they are going to feel that a lack of social consensus. So validation and just sharing those perspectives, those thoughts, those feelings, I think will help people to affirm those core values and strengthen their sense of identity to the extent that their identities might be threatened by the idea of climate change. And the last thing I want to say about resilience, I mean, there are plenty of things that can be said, but the last thing I want to say today is that identities, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, are social. They are personal, but they are also social. So we need to think about ways in which the social context can affirm people's environmental identities. And there are a variety of ways in which that can happen, but one that I would often recommend to people is that they get involved in some kind of activism, or at least an advocacy group where they can get together with other people who agree with them about the problem of climate change, maybe take group action, or at least jointly affirm that this is an issue, and build all those positive emotions and experiences that often accompany collective action. So that too, I think, is an important part of resilience. So that was mostly what I wanted to say about environmental identity and related to climate change. I'll just take a couple more minutes and say something about the Ipcc. So you probably all know, but just in case anybody doesn't know and is too embarrassed to say so, this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's a huge international body, um, sort of jointly sponsored by the UN and the World Meteorological Association, I think. And it's got hundreds of people, and they put together these assessment reports every few years to summarize the scientific research-based knowledge on climate change. And they do that to establish this shared database of, reliable science, not opinion, jointly arrived at by scientists from around the globe, so that hopefully it can't be dismissed as, well, that scientist is biased, or that one is, got a political agenda. And it really tries to be hugely comprehensive. And they are working on their 6th assessment report. There are also these intervening reports that come out. There was one on climate change in land. There was one on what it would look like if we increased by 1.5 degrees Celsius. Those have both come out in the last few years. Until, well, in the beginning, they didn't talk about psychology at all. Not surprisingly. I think in the beginning, everybody thought climate change was a physical science issue. There was, I don't know actually when it started, so maybe Janet will know when we get into the more general discussion, but at some point they did start to include psychological research relevant to mitigation and how you can get people to change behavior. But in the 5th assessment report, which came out in 2014, they did make reference to mental health impacts, but it was very brief. In the 6th assessment report, which I'm now working on, and which Janet is also a contributing author for, there's a huge section on mental health and well-being. And I like the idea of well-being because I really don't want to think that all we need to do is prevent people from developing mental illnesses. We really want to talk about a world in which people can thrive. So this work is currently going on. It's been really interesting. I feel very privileged to be involved. It's certainly an experience in terms of the political implications and the size of the group and the international character of the group, an experience like none other. I mean, I've been in lots of meetings and organizations that try to be international, and what that usually means is either mostly North America or mostly European or half and half, with a few, probably Asian, maybe a couple from South America, couple from Australia. But this is a totally international group, and deliberately so, so it is definitely not dominated by people from North America. So yeah, so that's something I think to feel optimistic about. And the first meeting I went to, I felt very optimistic because there I was in a room full of hundreds of people who had come together. It's you don't get paid to do it, work very hard to produce this report. So not only that, the fact that they were all there and they were kind of joking and smiling and having a good time, I thought, if all these climate scientists, if all these people who understand climate change are feeling in a pretty good mood, there's probably hope for humanity. So I think that's a good place for me to stop.
Thanks a lot, Susan. I think that's just a good place. I've got some questions. I'm sure other people do too, but I thought this is a good place for us to go into our small group again. And we can talk about just some things that are brewing for us from Susan's talk. How much time do you think, Amy, would be good? So we have some time for